This is not a story about betrayal. It's about the moment someone realized she was being underestimated and chose not to warn anyone. For a long time, I believed that love was about patience. Not the kind of patience you find in quotes or movies. The quiet kind. The kind that swallows words. The kind that learns how to adapt instead of confront. The kind that chooses peace over saying what it really feels. That was always me. From the outside, our relationship looked normal. Nothing spectacular, nothing chaotic. Stable enough not to raise questions. We had routines, coffee in the morning always served the same way, evenings on the couch, the television on, our phones glowing brighter than our faces, weekends organized around what was easiest, not what mattered most. People said we were calm. He liked to say I was easy to deal with. At first, it sounded like a compliment. He said I didn't complicate things, that I understood, that everything flowed with me. I confused that with love, but over time, easy started to mean predictable. Then it started to mean guaranteed. He began to assume I would always understand, that I wouldn't mind, that I would adjust. And I did. When he cancelled plans at the last minute, I said it was fine. When he made decisions without asking me, I told myself it wasn't worth arguing. When he joked that I thought too much, I smiled, even when something tightened inside my chest. I wasn't silent. I was careful. Careful not to seem demanding. Careful not to create conflict. Careful not to become that woman. Little by little, being calm became my entire identity. And he noticed. He noticed that I took a breath before answering, that I chose my words carefully, that I preferred silence over insistence. So he started speaking with certainty, not aggression, certainty. You don't really care about that. It's all the same to you. You trust me. They weren't questions, they were conclusions. I remember one particular night. Nothing serious happened, and that's what made it dangerous. We were sitting at the kitchen table. I was talking about something simple, a thought, an idea, a desire. He was on his phone. Without looking up, he smiled and said, "You always overthink things." It was said lightly, without harshness, without the intention to hurt. But it landed. Something closed in my chest, but I swallowed it. I convinced myself I was exaggerating, that he didn't mean anything by it. I was very good at explaining his behavior to myself. I explained why he interrupted, why he forgot things that mattered to me, why my needs always sounded negotiable, while his sounded final. And because I explained everything so well, I stayed. I believed that loving meant enduring, that maturity meant not reacting, that if I didn't make things difficult, everything would be fine. What I didn't realize was that my silence was being translated as permission. He didn't see patience, he saw permanence. He didn't see understanding, he saw dependence. Little by little, he stopped checking, stopped asking how I felt, stopped confirming whether I agreed, stopped noticing whether I was still choosing this or simply remaining. The imbalance wasn't loud enough to scare me away. It was subtle enough to trap me. And the hardest part to admit, I helped build it. Because every time I let something slide, every time I chose silence over truth, every time I thought, this isn't worth it, I taught him something. I taught him that I would stay. The first sign didn't come as a shock. It came the way almost everything between us did, subtle enough to be dismissed, but heavy enough not to be forgotten. It was a comment. The kind that feels too small to justify discomfort, yet too sharp to ignore. We were talking about a decision he had made on his own, something practical, a routine adjustment. He spoke as someone who had already resolved everything. I listened, took a breath, and said carefully that I would have liked to be consulted. He smiled, not an ironic smile, a calm one, secure. "You know I handle these things better," he said. "And in the end, you always agree with me, always." The word stayed in the air a second longer than it should have. I tried to respond, not to argue, just to exist inside the conversation. But he continued just as calmly, "You don't need to take everything so seriously." That was when something shifted. Not because of the sentence itself, but because of how naturally it was said, as if my reaction had already been predicted, as if my role in that dialogue was simply to accept. I felt the urge to explain, to justify why it mattered to me, to say it wasn't about the decision, it was about participation. But I stopped. For the first time, not out of fear of conflict, but out of clarity. I realized something simple and uncomfortable. He wasn't listening to understand. He was listening to close the conversation. And it didn't happen just once. It repeated itself in small situations, small choices, small comments. You're too emotional. Trust me, let me handle it. Always in the tone of someone who believed he was being reasonable. And I began to notice something else. He spoke as if I depended on him to decide. As if my presence was support, not partnership. As if my silence were agreement, not restraint. And maybe that was exactly how he saw it. Because until then, I had always lowered my voice, always yielded first, always found a way not to turn anything into a problem. But at that moment, something in me started observing instead of reacting. I mentally revisited other moments, other sentences, other silences. I realized how many times I had changed plans, how many times I had postponed my own desires, how often I had explained to myself why something wasn't that important. And then I noticed something even more unsettling. He had grown used to it, not to my calmness, but to my adaptation. He didn't openly diminish me. He didn't shout. He didn't humiliate. He simply stopped including me. And the hardest part was that he genuinely seemed to believe everything was fine, because in his mind, it always had been. That night, I remember thinking that maybe I was exaggerating, that maybe it was just a phase, that maybe all relationships had moments like that. But one thought kept returning, insistent. If it were truly irrelevant, it wouldn't hurt. That was when I started paying attention, not to what he said, but to what he assumed. He assumed I wouldn't go far, that I wouldn't change, that I wouldn't set boundaries. He assumed I needed him more than he needed me. And without realizing it, he began acting on those assumptions. He spoke with less care, decided with more haste, ignored with more ease. Not because he was cruel, but because he was comfortable. Too comfortable to question, too comfortable to adjust, too comfortable to imagine consequences. And I began doing something new. I didn't confront him. I didn't announce a change. I didn't warn anyone. I observed. I observed how he spoke when he believed I wouldn't react. How he decided when he believed I had no alternative. How he smiled with the certainty of someone who thought he was in control. And that's when I understood something fundamental. Devaluation doesn't begin when someone puts you down. It begins when someone stops considering you, and he already had. The moment didn't arrive as an ultimatum. It arrived as certainty, his certainty. There was no heated argument, no slammed doors, no threat of separation. And that was exactly what made everything so clear. He was already speaking as someone who knew the ending. We were talking about the future, nothing dramatic, practical plans, the kind of conversation that seems mature but hides decisions already made. He spoke about changes, about choices that would affect our routine, about paths he had already considered on his own. I listened, and at some point, I asked a simple question. And me? He laughed. A short laugh, automatic. The kind that comes from someone who doesn't expect resistance. You'll adapt, he said. You always do. In that instant, everything settled inside me. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel the urge to argue. I felt something far more dangerous. Clarity. He wasn't being impulsive. He wasn't upset. He was too comfortable to measure his words. He kept talking, explaining why the decision made sense, using logic, talking about stability, about security, speaking as if he were reassuring me. You don't need to worry. It will be good for us. You wouldn't leave over something like this. It wasn't a provocation. It was a conviction. He wasn't asking if I would stay. He was stating it. In that moment, I realized he didn't see me as someone who could choose to leave. He saw me as someone who needed him, and maybe until then that had been true, because I had always stayed, always explained, always understood, always been the one who gave in. So why would he doubt it? He spoke with the calm of someone who felt secure, secure in the bond, secure in the dynamic, secure in the power, and I did something he didn't expect. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I simply stayed silent, not a silence of fear, but of observation. He continued talking for a few minutes, talking to himself, really. When he finished, he asked, "Is everything okay?" I looked at him, gave a small smile, and said, "It is." He relaxed, because that answer confirmed everything he believed, confirmed that I wouldn't create problems, that I wouldn't change anything, that I would remain there. He confused my silence with submission, confused my calm with weakness, confused my presence with dependence, and it was on that mistake that he leaned. That night, he slept peacefully, secure, convinced he had control of the situation. I stayed awake, not thinking about arguing, not planning revenge, not rehearsing speeches. I was organizing something much quieter, the awareness that I was being underestimated. And when someone is absolutely certain that you will never leave, they allow themselves not to care. They allow themselves to decide alone, to stop listening, to relax too much. He believed I depended on him emotionally, that I wouldn't have the courage, that I had nowhere else to go. He didn't consider one thing. I didn't need to announce my departure to begin leaving. That night, something ended. Not the relationship, not yet, but the version of me that kept trying to be understood. Before continuing, let me tell you something. If at any point in this story you thought, "This has happened to me," or felt that familiar tightening in your chest, this pause is for you, because this isn't just my story. It's the story of those who kept staying, who kept yielding, who were told again and again that everything was fine, even while feeling that something was deeply wrong. If you've ever been underestimated like this, or know someone who has, subscribe. Here, stories don't end small. I didn't announce any changes after that conversation. I didn't change my tone. I didn't demand explanations. I didn't make promises. From the outside, everything looked the same, but inside, something had rearranged itself. I began to see situations from a distance, as if I were watching a dynamic I had lived inside for far too long. I started noticing details I had once normalized. The way he spoke when he assumed I already agreed. The way he ended conversations before I finished my thoughts. The way he leaned on the idea that I would always be there. He didn't need to confirm, he assumed, and that showed in everything. He made plans without telling me, changed directions as if they were technical adjustments, spoke about the future as if I were a fixed object in the background. "We'll figure it out. You understand? We'll deal with that later." Always plural, always decided in the singular, and I began doing something I had never done before. I stopped explaining. When something bothered me, I didn't give long justifications. I didn't try to convince. I didn't translate feelings into logic to see if he would accept them. I simply noted the gesture, the tone, the lack of care, not to use later, but not to forget. He noticed something was different, not consciously, but he felt it. Sometimes he asked if I was being strange. I said everything was fine, and it was. Because for the first time, I wasn't carrying the balance alone. I wasn't at war. I wasn't running away. I wasn't making secret plans. I was waking up, and awakening makes no noise. It happens when you stop spending energy trying to be chosen, when you stop begging for consideration disguised as dialogue, when you realize you don't need to convince anyone of your worth. I understood that for a long time I had behaved like someone who needed to prove she deserved to stay. And without noticing, he had begun to behave like someone who believed I had no choice. That was the foundation of the underestimation. Not a lack of love, but certainty of permanence. He believed I needed him more than he needed me, that I was afraid of being alone. that I would never break something I had sustained for so long. And perhaps that was exactly what made everything so comfortable for him. Because when someone believes you will never leave, they relax too much. They relax their care, their respect, their listening. And I was there watching, without warning, without threats, without asking for change. Because when someone underestimates you, the biggest mistake is letting them know you've awakened. The awakening didn't come as a grand decision. It wasn't a powerful sentence. It wasn't an ultimatum. It wasn't a definitive conversation. It felt more like turning off a constant noise. For a long time, I lived adjusting the environment so everything would work, measuring words, adjusting schedules, reorganizing expectations, always attentive to the mood, always making sure nothing fell apart. And then I stopped, not from physical exhaustion, but from clarity. I realized I was investing too much energy in something that gave me no presence in return. So I began removing small pieces of myself from the equation, not dramatically, almost invisibly. I stopped anticipating needs, stopped reminding him of commitments that weren't mine, stopped explaining feelings that weren't being heard. If something needed to be said, I said it once, clearly, without defense. And if it wasn't heard, I didn't insist. That changed everything. Because he was used to my insistence, to my patient explanations, to my constant attempt at alignment. When that disappeared, he felt an emptiness, but didn't know how to name it. He asked sometimes if everything was okay. I said it was, and it was. Because for the first time, I wasn't negotiating with myself. I also began to change the way I looked at things. I started noticing how I felt after each interaction. Not what he said, not what he promised, but the effect. Did I leave conversations feeling lighter or tighter? And the answer began to repeat itself. I realized that for a long time I had confused love with tolerance and maturity with silence. I thought being strong meant enduring, when in truth, being strong meant recognizing limits. And the clearest limit I found was this: I no longer needed to explain myself to be considered. If something mattered to me, it mattered. Period. And if it wasn't treated that way, the response wasn't speaking louder, it was moving differently. I began investing energy in myself. Simple things, small choices, decisions I had always postponed for when everything was okay. I realized that when never came, so I began now. He noticed external changes before internal ones. He noticed I was less available, less predictable, less centered around him. Not cold, but firm. I no longer made a point of always being there. I didn't adjust everything to fit. I didn't seek validation, and that made him uncomfortable, because when someone who has always stayed begins to withdraw, it doesn't look like distance. It looks like threat. He started asking more questions, approaching in small bursts, showing attention that didn't come with depth. It was late. Not in the sense that there was no solution, but in the sense that I was no longer waiting to be chosen. I had stopped explaining, stopped reacting, stopped fighting for a place that should have been natural. And that was the true awakening, not the decision to leave, but the decision to no longer depend on staying. Because when you stop needing, you see clearly, and with clarity, you begin to act. The turn didn't come with an announcement. There was no decisive conversation, no tears, no sentence meant to change everything. Because I no longer needed to explain anything. The action came through daily life, through small choices, through decisions that together build a path with no return. I began organizing my life as someone who no longer needed permission to exist. Not to provoke, not to teach a lesson, but because it finally made sense. The first thing that changed was my time. I stopped shaping my days around his schedule, stopped waiting, stopped rescheduling commitments with myself. When I had plans, I kept them. When I had desires, I respected them. He noticed, not right away, but he felt the difference. "You've been busy," he commented one day. No accusation, no real curiosity. "I've been doing my things," I replied. Nothing more. He started to feel uncomfortable with the loss of my predictability. Before, he knew where I would be, what I would say, how I would react. Now he didn't, and that removed him from the comfortable place of someone who feels too secure. He began noticing details he had once ignored: my absence in small moments, my lack of reaction in others. When he made decisions alone, I didn't argue. I simply adjusted my life around my choices, not his. That confused him because he expected resistance, expected explanations, expected deep down that I would try to pull him back to the center. But I was no longer orbiting. There was a specific moment when he realized it was simple. He spoke about a future plan, something he had always mentioned naturally, assuming I would be there. "When we do this," I interrupted calmly, "don't count on me." It wasn't harsh, it wasn't aggressive, it was factual. He laughed, thinking it was a joke. "What do you mean?" I looked at him. No tension, no challenge. "I'm not going," I repeated. It was the first time he saw me not negotiate. The silence that followed wasn't comfortable. He tried to regain control of the conversation, asked why, wanted to understand, but there was no long explanation. "Because I don't want to," was all I said. And that destabilized everything, because he was used to having access to my reasons, my feelings, my concessions. Now, he had only the decision. He realized too late that something had changed, that the woman who always stayed, who always adjusted, who always understood, was no longer there in the same way. There was no fight after that. There was attempt. He began paying more attention, asking more questions, showing availability in brief, pointed moments. But it was different. It wasn't genuine care. It was recovery of territory. And I was no longer competing for space. I was moving forward, without anger, without resentment, without the need to win. The turn wasn't me leaving at that moment. It was him realizing that he no longer had me as a guarantee, and that scared him. But fear doesn't change patterns when the other person has already changed position. I didn't need to shout to be heard, didn't need to prove anything, didn't need to slam doors shut. I simply walked away from a place where I was no longer considered, and that was enough. After the turn, nothing exploded, and maybe that was the hardest part for him to understand, because he expected reaction, expected confrontation, expected a version of me trying to be understood. What came instead was organized silence. I didn't disappear overnight. I didn't make a scene. I didn't turn the ending into a spectacle. I simply began to move forward. Conversations became shorter, meetings less frequent, decisions independent. He tried to approach me the way he knew how, with questions that came too late, with vague promises, with attention that appeared only when he felt loss. "You've been distant," he said once. I thought of all the times I'd felt that way, sitting beside him, trying to be seen, but I didn't answer with resentment. "I'm in a different place," I said. It was true. He didn't know how to deal with that. Because in his mind, distance had always been a temporary threat. Something solved with conversation, with time, with small adjustments. But this wasn't distance, it was relocation. I had stepped out of the role he knew. He began remembering things, details, old promises. He spoke about the future as someone trying to retrieve something that had slipped through his fingers. But the future he described didn't include who I was now. It included the old version, the predictable one, the one who always stayed. And that version wasn't coming back, not because I was hurt, but because I was clear. I understood that for a long time I had been presence without reciprocity, support without backing, understanding without listening. And I also understood that he wasn't a villain. He simply believed in the dynamic I had helped create. He believed I would never leave because I never had. But realizing that no longer placed responsibility on me. I didn't need to teach anymore, or correct, or wait for him to understand. The consequence wasn't punishment, it was absence. Absence of access, absence of guarantee, absence of the woman who was always there. He felt it, not in a dramatic way, but in routine, in empty spaces, in solitary decisions. in the lack of someone who used to adjust everything. He tried a few times to return, but it wasn't about trying. It was about having cared earlier, and that lesson doesn't always arrive on time. I moved on, rebuilt my days without noise, rediscovered forgotten desires, began choosing with more awareness, not to prove anything, but because now I could. I didn't leave stronger because I walked away. I left stronger because I learned to stay with myself, and that was the real consequence, not for him. For me, there was never a moment when I announced I was leaving, and maybe that's what confuses people the most when they underestimate someone for too long. Because in their minds, leaving always looks impulsive, a sudden break, an exaggerated reaction. But that wasn't it. I didn't leave when it hurt. I didn't leave when I felt ignored. I didn't leave when I realized I was being sidelined. I left when I understood. I understood it wasn't a lack of explanation. It wasn't a communication issue. It wasn't a phase. It was position. I was in a place where my presence was comfortable, but my voice was optional. And no one changes that while they're certain you have nowhere else to go. For a long time, I confused love with permanence. I believed staying was proof of maturity, that enduring was a sign of strength. But the truth is, staying when you stop being considered is not strength, it's forgetting yourself. I didn't leave with anger. I didn't leave trying to win. I didn't leave waiting for regret. I left quietly because that's how I learned to listen to myself. And when I listened, it became clear. I no longer needed to convince anyone to value me. He only realized my worth when he lost access. And that says more about the dynamic than about me. Some people only respect limits when they stop being theoretical and become real. Not because they are cruel, but because they grew too used to your presence. I don't need him to understand everything. I don't need that to move forward. Understanding doesn't change the past, and I don't live there anymore. Today, I recognize the signs I once ignored. I notice when I start adjusting too much, when I begin shrinking to fit, and most importantly, I know how to leave before I disappear. Because the biggest turn in this story wasn't him realizing too late. It was me realizing in time. Being alone was not a punishment. At first, it felt strange, too quiet, like a room after someone leaves, when the echo still lingers. But unlike before, I didn't try to fill that silence by rushing into something else. I stayed in it. Alone, I returned to myself. I began to observe who I was when I didn't need to please, when I didn't need to soften my tone, when I didn't need to fit into anyone else's expectations. I started asking myself simple questions, questions I hadn't asked in years. What do I like? What calms me? What truly bothers me? And most of all, at what point did I begin abandoning myself so I wouldn't be abandoned? The answers didn't come all at once. They came in small memories. Things I used to do before him. Old laughter, forgotten interests. I reconnected with my inner child, not in a naive way, but in an honest one. That part of me that didn't need to explain herself to exist. That felt without apologizing. That knew when something wasn't right, even without knowing how to explain why. For a long time, I silenced that voice in order to seem mature, strong, balanced. But maturity isn't silencing who you are. It's learning to listen without fear. And that's what I did. I rebuilt my self-worth without grand speeches, without ready-made phrases, without needing to prove anything to anyone. It happened in the everyday moments, in the way I began to look at myself, in how I protected my time, in the respect I gave my own desires. I stopped asking myself if I was being too much. I started asking if I was being true to myself, and for the first time in a very long time, the answer began to be yes. Today, I am well. Not because everything is perfect, not because it never hurts anymore, but because I no longer shrink in order to stay. I learned that love does not require disappearance, that partnership is not built on underestimation, and that being alone is far less lonely than being with someone who treats you like a guarantee. I didn't need him to understand. I needed to return to myself, and I did. Some people only realize your value when they no longer have access. Others realize it in time, and that changes everything. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to Stories We Tell, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us keep creating stories about strength, self-respect, and new beginnings, because stories that restore dignity deserve to be told and remembered. Thank you for being here.